Welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate, but so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those tragedies and challenges you faced and or are facing right now, do not define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And nobody I know really knows that better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, my friend, and I'm doing it in reverse order, and now I'm ending with and host of this show, Warwick Fairfax. And you'll understand why I inverted all that stuff. So Warwick, this is a very special episode we have today, and I'm really looking forward to it.
It surely is a big milestone for us. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to it as well.
So what we're talking about, what we're hinting at, folks, is that this is right now, today, when this episode drops, November 5th of 2024, is the exact 5-year anniversary of the Beyond the Crucible podcast. And so the first one was November 5th, 2019, 5 years ago today. And just for grins, it's kind of fun to just, here's how it all began. And it was Warwick doing the intro, but I'll do it. I won't try to do it with an Australian accent. I'll just do, here's the first words. Here are the first words ever spoken on the Beyond the Crucible podcast from Warwick. That was this: welcome to the Beyond the Crucible podcast. The podcast is all about how you move from a life-altering experience, which can often be extremely painful, to leading a life of significance, a life that's on purpose and that's helping others. As we'll see in a moment, Warwick was good at the teaser at the beginning. Look at that. As we'll see in a moment, he said, this is very personal to me. Warwick, you flew solo in that first episode, which featured you telling your Crucible story and how you bounced back from it. Our listeners and viewers have heard that story a few times over the last 5 years. But what you haven't really talked about is why you decided to do a podcast. What emotions were you going through when you first spoke into the microphone about your worst day and about how you didn't let it define you? And those were words, right? Your worst day, you didn't let it define you. Those are words we hadn't even thought of when we started the podcast. They came through the podcast. So my first question to you is, how did you decide, or why did you decide, better than how did you decide? Why did you decide to launch a podcast? And what was it like recording that first show?
Gary, just as we're talking here, I'm thinking about those words that I ended that initial comment on that very first episode when I said, as we'll see in a moment, this is very personal to me. Just briefly for listeners and those watching, I grew up in a very large family media business. It was 150 years old, started by John Fairfax, my great-great-grandfather, a great person of faith. There was friction within the family. My father died in early 1987, fresh back from Harvard Business School after a stint on Wall Street and at Oxford. I launched this $2.25 billion takeover to bring the company back to the ideals of the founder and make sure the company was well managed, protected from takeover. Things went wrong right from the start. 3 years later, in 1990, company went bankrupt. And, it continued, but it was in other people's hands, not family hands. So it was in other people's control, not family control. So the reason I said this is personal to me is that was a devastating crucible to me. It was life-altering. There was my life before John Fairfax Limited, the family company, went into bankruptcy, and then the life after. And so that's really why I wrote the book, which has stories from my family, my dad, the founder, John Fairfax, stories from history and other themes. But having written the book, the question was, well, how do we promote the book and how do we promote the ideas within the book more widely, that your worst day doesn't have to define you, that, how do you get beyond your crucible, the title of this podcast? And so one way is speaking, which is fine. But for me, when I think it may actually be you, Gary, that mentioned it and suggested it, is with the podcast, and you've done a lot of work of Focus on the Family with Dr. Dobson and radio interviews. And, I guess that was pre-podcast era, but you've done dialogues and what have you. Mm-hmm. Just the thought of a podcast, intuitively it made sense because I'm a certified International Coach Federation coach. I love conversation. I love listening. So the idea of talking with the guest, having conversations about thoughts, about Crucible leadership and Beyond the Crucible, it kind of intuitively made sense. I'm somebody that's a curious person. I love listening and asking questions. So, and one of the other interesting things is before we launched this podcast, I'd been on some other people's podcasts talking about my story and thoughts on how you bounce back from tragedy and crucibles. And I kind of enjoyed that experience. So I thought, well, I enjoy being on other people's podcasts. Maybe we should, have our own.
Yeah. And you mentioned you did other podcasts, and as the PR guy for the team, I'm the one that booked you on those podcasts, and the form of a podcast suits you so well because radio interviews, as I'm sure you know, I've done a lot of them, as you mentioned. Radio interviews can be chopped up, staccato. You talk for like 15 seconds and then the host says something and you have to, as we say on the show, you have to land the plane several times. It's like take off, land, take off, land, take off, land about 8 times in the course of a conversation, where a podcast gives you the chance to really get into conversation. And you took to that as you were telling your story so well that indeed, I think it was me, indeed, who said, you're so good at this. Maybe you want to do a podcast. And that just the team sort of coalesced around that. And it became, what we pursued. And 5 years later, I think we have to say it's been a success. It's been a success. So you had some ideas, I know, at the beginning, Warwick, about what you wanted the show to be. Some thoughts tied to your book. And that book, folks, because I don't think we've mentioned the title, is Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. Some of those thoughts were tied to the book, but at the time, that book was still an unpublished manuscript. That book only existed on your computer, right? And you probably had a hard copy, right, printed out somewhere. But the book was not yet published, and it wouldn't be for 3 more years when we started this podcast 5 years ago. So, do you recall your hopes for Beyond the Crucible, the podcast, when it started 5 years ago today?
Yes, I was hoping to have that manuscript published, but one of the things that came up in conversation with folks is to get the book published, to get the ideas of the book published, you need to have different channels, whether it's social media, speaking. But one of those channels was potentially podcasts. A number of people that have ideas to hopefully inspire or help people, they have a podcast. And so it came up in conversation with you, Gary. And so one of the thoughts is, well, obviously I would like to get this book published. I'd like people to have heard of these themes when it gets published. So obviously from a public relations standpoint, having a podcast makes sense. But more broadly than, just helping to promote the book, it was another medium to tell some themes from the book, as I was sort of alluding to, themes involving coming back from adversity, stories from my father, Sir Warwick Fairfax, same name as me, except he was knighted. No armor and shield or sword. I guess they don't hand that out these days. The Queen of England doesn't. But anyway, knighthood nonetheless. And then my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax, who, as I said, started the family media business. There were also stories from historical leaders as well as faith and inspirational leaders. So there were different examples of leaders going through great trials and bouncing back. In addition to stories in the book of great leaders, if you will, there were also themes such as authenticity, faith, which we define as believing in something beyond yourself, character, vision, having a great team, which we now call a team of fellow travelers, and perseverance. So there are a number of themes in the book that I wanted to talk about. But in addition to that, I wanted to have conversation about some of these themes, not letting your worst day define you, authenticity, vision, character, these sorts of themes with other people who'd been through crucibles and had found a way to bounce back and move beyond them. So it was really a both and talk about some of the themes in the book, but also talk with other people about their experiences and how they got beyond their worst day to indeed live a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others.
And I think we can agree, right? We can agree on the fact that it's taken off beyond our wildest imaginations from those humble beginnings. That humble beginning, as I said, was you at the microphone by yourself. For episode 2, you were kind enough, you asked me to join you as your co-host. And I did not tell you this in advance, Warwick, and it's not going to surprise you in the slightest, but the very first episode was episode 2 that I co-hosted with you. What I'm wearing today on episode 235 is exactly what I wore then, down to my Iron Man lapel pin and my pocket square. This is the exact outfit I wore for episode 2, my first show with you on Beyond the Crucible over its 5 years. But it's very interesting because together, and I told you these statistics before we started recording, and it's fascinating. Together, we have interviewed 121 guests, discussed the insights to be learned about moving beyond your crucible from 17 movies, and done 55 episodes in which we discussed key aspects of the journey from setback to significance. And that's going to be the ground we cover here, folks, is this is not going to be your typical anniversary show where we sort of pat each other on the back and, take a victory lap for what we've accomplished. We're going to drill down to look at 5 key learnings that we gleaned from guests and or conversations we've had on this show that have helped inform us in the way that we talk about, the way that we teach about, the way that we offer, as Warwick has said, we're dealers in hope. We offer you hope about bouncing back from your crucible experiences. So that's going to be our format for the rest of the show, is 5 learnings that we picked up from this podcast over the last 5 years. So Warwick, these are truly watershed moments when we get into them that have grown our understanding of what it takes to move beyond setbacks and failure, aren't they? The Beyond the Crucible brand was built on the takeaways from your book, insights from your own story, as you said, and the stories of family and great leaders. But these things that we're going to discuss today, which grew our understanding of the journey beyond the crucible, came out of our discussions on the podcast, didn't they?
Absolutely, Gary. I mean, the numbers you just mentioned, 121 guests, 55 episodes where it's just you and me dialoguing about different themes and Beyond the Crucible, and 17 movies. I mean, that's astounding. I guess we must like movies. Which
yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. And, truth be told, there are some great lessons we can learn from movies. So if you haven't listened to too many of them on Beyond the Crucible, definitely worth a listen. They're fun, and I think you can learn a lot too. But it's hard to believe it's been 5 years since we started. That is a long time, and it's been a wonderful journey. I feel like I've learned so much from this podcast. I spent years getting my book, Crucible Leadership, published. It was published a couple of years ago in 2022. But since we've started this podcast in 2019, it is amazing that I feel like our understanding at Beyond the Crucible is so much deeper, in some of the themes that we've spoken about, authenticity, vision, team of fellow travelers, but other themes that really weren't in the book. It's just been, a real gift to me, the insights that guests have mentioned, and we're going to go through our top 5. they're just astounding. I've learned so much. I mean, I'm somebody that loves to learn. I'm curious, and it's hard to believe how much territory we've covered and how much insights that we've been able to glean from other guests, from dialoguing about subjects. It's really been a voyage of discovery, a voyage of learning, which has been inspiring, uplifting, and so much fun.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into those learnings that you mentioned. And the first one is this. Your worst day is your worst day. That's learning number one that we gleaned from this podcast. And that learning came from episode 5. So it didn't take us long out of the garage to get going to the big learning. And that was the episode where we interviewed father and son, Mike and David Charbonnet. Here's how we described the episode in the show notes. I'll read straight from the show notes. Mike was proud when his son, David, followed his footsteps to join the Navy SEALs. But when a parachuting accident left David paralyzed, Mike says his son summoned courage more remarkable than anything either of them ever had to muster in the military. David recounts how his accident left him feeling like his dreams and goals had disappeared, sending him into a dark depression made worse by the terrible physical pain. Mike endured his own deep sadness as his once athletic son lost his mobility and was devastated emotionally. Yet both father and son persevered and found new purpose helping others in the wake of their crucible experiences. David became the CEO of the VIP Neuro Rehabilitation Center, the groundbreaking physical therapy facility he first encountered as a patient, and Mike founded Beyond the Teams, a nonprofit that raises money for ill and injured servicemen and children, including those treated by VIP. In that conversation, Warwick, something happened that you have perhaps mentioned more than any other podcast moment we've had in these last 5 years. And that was the Charbonnets taught you a valuable lesson about the nature of crucibles that we all go through. Here, folks, is the clip of that moment.
We were at some gathering or something, and one of my friends who was in SEAL team was over, and he was telling a story. David was sitting close by, and he was talking about how he got hurt doing something. He says, so it was the worst pain ever. And he looked over and he saw David, and he said, oh, sorry, David. And David said something. I mean, this has been common wisdom from David. He said, that's okay, Ken. Everybody's pain is the worst pain ever. And just to go with what you were just sharing is like, so maybe you don't have a broken back, or maybe your child doesn't, but your pain is the worst pain ever. It's what God has decided you can handle and you need right now.
How did that moment impact you, Warwick? Not only at the moment, but in all the conversations your perspective on all the conversations we've had with people who've gone through crucibles since then, over the last 5 years.
Yeah, Gary, later on as we were talking, I remember feeling embarrassed. And I said to David, what I went through, losing a $2.25 billion family media company, 150-year-old company, yes, it was devastating to me personally, but I said, David, this is nothing compared to what you went through being paralyzed as a Navy SEAL in a parachuting training accident. And David so graciously, in essence, said, Warwick, it's not a competition. Right. Your worst day is your worst day. And I felt at that moment that my first thought was, that was such a gracious thing to say. That comment was so full of grace, because it's always easy to think, oh, maybe I'm ill, but maybe there's somebody else who's more ill than I am. Maybe I'm having challenges with my kids or my marriage or at work. But typically you will not be the greatest of all time in terms of nobody's gone through worse than what you have. I mean, it's possible, but in sense unlikely. So when you come across a person that you feel is in far worse shape than you are, has gone through much more unspeakable tragedy than you have, you can feel embarrassed about complaining. You can feel guilty. Oh, I guess I shouldn't be allowed to grieve and to be angry and sad. And really this comment from David Charbonnet says, your worst pain is your worst pain. It's not a competition. You have every right to feel angry, to grieve, to feel sad, to be in pain. Obviously, as we talk about Beyond the Crucible, it's not wise to sit there for the rest of your life in that, but it's completely understandable, and nor is it wrong to complain and just feel like this is awful and, why me? That's all very natural. Staying there forever may not be helpful, but it's not a competition as to who has had the worst day. So that comment was such a gift.
And I know that comment, that perspective, right? The fact that it happened in episode 5 is fantastic because that perspective has really colored, hasn't it, your interviews with the guests that we've had on who maybe have thought the same thing, that their crucible wasn't really as bad as somebody else's crucible. I mean, the reason that you've mentioned that as often as you have is because you've reassured guests of that very thing, right?
Absolutely. And it made me feel like I don't have to apologize anymore for this was awful. And I don't apologize anymore. It was awful to me. And yes, you're right. When we talk to guests, we often tell them that story from David Charbonnet and your worst day is your worst day. Because even some of our guests can feel almost guilty about, it was bad, but, maybe there are others that have been through worse. So, it was a gift to me. I think it's a gift to our guests. And, it was very freeing to me. It's okay to feel bad about what you went through and not feel guilty. So it's an incredible gift.
And that's not the only gift. I got ahead of you for a second. That's not the only gift we're going to talk about, because our next moment, right? Our key learning number 2 is your crucible can be a gift, is something else that we learned through this show. Your crucible can be a gift. And that comes from episode 80 with Stacy Kopass. Here's what we said in the show notes for that episode. What Stacy Kopass knows about resilience was born of tragedy. A diving accident at 12 in her native Australia left her a quadriplegic whose spirit was in tatters. But she turned a corner emotionally when she realized, her quote, "We connect with other people through our adversity, not our success." Today, in her writing, speaking, and coaching, she shares how resilience is a skill that can be learned just like building muscle in a gym. As I said, Warwick, this is another example of something a guest said that hit you as a bit of a jolt, if I can be so bold as to say that. The way she talked about what she came to learn after suffering this terrible injury was something that really didn't compute for you at first. So let's take a look and a listen at that clip.
And ultimately, I got to the point where I had to make a decision. And it was that, proverbial fork in the road where I had to say, well, look, am I going to get on with it or am I going to give up? And ultimately, I just went, well, look, I can't change what's happened. I can't, it's a fact. But what I can do is I can change how I feel about it. I can change the story I tell about it, and I can change what I do next. So there was that element of just having to make a decision. And so often people have gone, well, it can't be that simple. And I'm like, well, yeah, it actually was. It just came to a point where it's like, you've just got to choose to get on with it. And I did. And so what I ended up doing then was I actually then, instead of looking back at that accident with, with negativity, I actually looked back at it with gratitude. And I actually looked at it and I became grateful, and I began to look for, how has this changed my life in a positive way, and what are the opportunities that I can have from this?
So what was your reaction to that moment, and how has it affected, Warwick, the way you look at your own crucible and the way that you talk to others about their crucibles?
Yeah, Gary, when Stacy said that she had gratitude for what she went through, that was just almost incomprehensible. I mean, as we learned on that podcast, and as you related, Stacy was an athletic girl. She was 12 years old, grew up in the suburbs of Sydney. And like a lot of kids, they don't always listen to their parents. There was an above ground pool, which, as you know, are often not particularly deep. She dove into that pool and she became paralyzed. She was diagnosed as a quadriplegic. All her dreams were seemingly shattered. She had suicidal ideation, substance abuse challenges. It was a horrific experience. And as she relates in that clip, she came to a fork in the road. She had a choice to make, a decision. Am I going to, in a sense, wallow in negativity and self-recrimination? Or am I going to find a way forward, a more positive way forward, an attitude of gratitude, if you will? And she made that choice that she couldn't change what happened. She was going to find a way to move forward. I mean, to make that choice when you're in that kind of state and you're at the lowest of lows,
right,
is sort of amazing. And as, we were talking, she said basically that what she went through, being paralyzed, was a gift. And her perspective is that the person that she became, which was a coach, a speaker, somebody that comes alongside others, would not have been possible without the pain that she went through. Now, that's her perspective. But when she said what I went through, I mean, how is being diagnosed as a quadriplegic a gift? I find it almost, well, I do. I find it incomprehensible. It took me a while.
It did. I remember talking to you about it. It did take you a while indeed. Yeah.
It wasn't like, oh yeah, this makes sense for me. It's like, well, that's pretty strange. And I hear what Stacy is saying and I understand her perspective about she wouldn't be the person she was without it. In that sense, it was a gift. But a while later, I came to believe that my own Crucible, losing a $2.25 billion, 150-year-old family media company, was also a gift. And that was not easy to say because I felt like I let my parents down. The founder of John Fairfax Limited, my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax, 4,000 plus employees, caused, instability in the family. It wasn't a gift necessarily. The bankruptcy of a 150-year-old family media company to other family members or employees. But to me personally, I came to see it as a gift because it freed me from living up to expectations of my family, especially my parents, and living a life that really wasn't me. I'm more of a reflective advisor than a, take no prisoners corporate executive that, you do see in the media in some circles. It just felt like this wasn't me. My kids get to grow up differently than they would have growing up in Australia. So it was a gift in a lot of ways to me, but it took me a while to be able to see that devastating crucible as a gift.
You've used the word about your own crucible experience, that it was deliverance from what you called a gilded prison in some other conversations. So that really has impacted you and has allowed you to change your perspective. And one of the things I love, Warwick, about these first two things that we're talking about, right? The Charbonnet saying your worst day is your worst day. And Stacy saying your crucible can be a gift is what they did for you. And they empowered you to not only talk about it from your perspective, but to give that same gift to others, is that it gave you permission to grieve your crucible. And it also gave you perspective to not stay there, right? The Charbonnets gave you permission to grieve your crucible. And Stacy's comment gave you the perspective to not stay there. Is that a fair assessment?
It really is, Gary. Stacy's decision to find something positive about what happened. What can be positive about being diagnosed as a quadriplegic after a diving accident? It would seem there's nothing positive about that. But she made that choice because what's the alternative? to spiral into negativity, depression, suicidal ideation. And she was there. As she mentioned, she did have suicidal ideation. So you're going to stay there? Is that how you want to spend the rest of your life? And so, yeah, I mean, I came to realize that I get to do what I want to do, lead my own life. We've lived in the U.S. Since the early 90s. My wife's American. My kids all grew up here. You know, my kids, who are now all adults, they got to chart their own path. There wasn't the, gee, you know, you need to go in the family and media business. And how would I have handled that? I'd like to think, you know, maybe okay, but who's to say? The subtle pressure, and gosh, I don't know that I want to take on all those expectations. Being a Fairfax in Sydney is a bit like being a Rockefeller or a Bush or a Kennedy. Everybody's looking at you. You make one mistake and, you know, it's going to be in the papers. I mean, it's just, the pressure is intense. You've got family rivalries going on. So I got to chart my own path. My kids got to chart their own path. And so, in so many ways, it was a gift. I mean, I wouldn't be here, you know, with the Beyond the Crucible podcast, having conversations with you. I wouldn't have written the book. I wouldn't have been speaking about Beyond the Crucible themes. None of that would have happened. I would have been living somebody else's dream, namely my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax's dream, in this gilded prison of, you know, a media company. I mean, I can't imagine it would have been a very fun life. Who knows? But I don't think it would have been very fun. Not to me, anyway. As you say, it would have been like a gilded prison.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We talk a lot about a life of significance and you know, success versus significance, and we're not against success, but you know, don't aim for that as your true north. And really, what you're discussing is, I think it's safe to say, had the takeover gone well and gone, you know, you'd be more successful, perhaps, right? But I don't know if your life of significance, what you're enjoying now in your life of significance, as you say, is because of what happened in your crucible, right?
Yeah. I mean, either scenario, if the takeover had been successful, or if I had a bit more common sense, never made the takeover in the first place, yes, I could have been more successful, wealthier, I guess. And we were certainly very comfortable. But, you know, there's always more, I guess. But, you know, what kind of life would it have been? I mean, ironically, the company was founded on my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax's life of significance, his vision. And that's good for him, and that's great. I would have been living a life of significance, except it wasn't my life of significance. One thing we don't really talk about much here, the life of significance you lead, it's got to be yours. You can't inherit a life of significance. I don't care how noble it is. I mean, producing papers that were impartial, that was the original vision, to uplift the colony of Australia in the 1800s. That was a noble vision, a very noble vision. And I applaud John Fairfax for that vision. But that wasn't my vision. It was one that I inherited. So you got to live your own life of significance. Yes, it's significance, not just success, but it's got to be your life of significance. And that's what I'm living now. As much as I admire John Fairfax, it doesn't make sense for me to live his life and his life of significance. As great a man that he was, I've got to live my own life of significance.
Yeah. And there we are, right? This whole episode is about what the podcast has taught us, learnings from the podcast that help us offer, be dealers in hope to people who are listening. And you just came up with, we haven't talked about this much, but here's the thing, your life of significance has to be your life of significance. So for the 10-year anniversary, that's going to be one of the things we talk about. Your life of significance has to be your life of significance. Let's move on to the third learning that we've gleaned over the last the first 5 years of the Beyond the Crucible podcast, and that is, you can't get beyond your crucible without forgiveness. The subject of forgiveness is actually, this was interesting to me when I researched sort of setting up this episode. The subject of forgiveness is actually the only dialogue episode, just you and me talking, that we've done 2 episodes on, shows 9 and 73. The first one talked, Warwick, about your own journey of forgiving yourself. The second talked about more generally how people can forgive themselves and others. You also have very prominent mentions in your book about those who modeled forgiveness in a way that instructed and moved you, including your father. Here's how we describe the second of these 2 episodes, episode number 73, in our show notes for that podcast episode. Have you suffered setback and failure? We said. Then you probably have struggled with anger and maybe bitterness as you think of those who contributed to your pain. In this episode, Crucible Leadership founder and Beyond the Crucible host, Warwick Fairfax, discusses with co-host Gary Schneeberger. We don't often mention ourselves in the show notes. That's kind of fun. Discusses with co-host Gary Schneeberger the critical need to forgive those who have wronged us or even ourselves in order to move past our crucibles and toward a life of significance. Warwick lays out 7 steps you can begin practicing today to cultivate what he calls the noble character to practice forgiveness. From understanding a difference between forgiving someone and condoning their actions, to channeling your pain in more productive ways than being consumed by bitterness, you will walk away from this discussion with practical action steps you can take beginning today to start walking in this truth expressed by Marianne Williamson. Quote, "The practice of forgiveness is our most important contribution to the healing of the world." Here's the clip, Warwick, of you laying out the stakes of lack of forgiveness of ourselves and others in moving beyond our crucible.
Why forgiveness has come up a lot is we're all about here at Crucible Leadership how to get beyond setbacks and failures to live a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. Well, often when bad things happen, whether it's a setback, a failure of your own making, a setback, could be a physical setback, maybe we've had victims of abuse, we've had all sorts of different kinds of crucibles. Very often there's blame, there's anger, even there's bitterness, even rage. And the challenge is, at least it's our belief and my belief, that you cannot move on with your life. You cannot get beyond your crucible, title of the podcast, without forgiveness. And so sometimes blame is something like, it's something that we want to hold and cling on to. We don't want to give them the satisfaction of forgiving them. If it's something that we've done ourselves, we don't feel that we're worth forgiving. And so really why we're talking about this is, if you don't forgive, if you don't try to stop blaming somebody, whether it's you, others, God, the universe, you can't move on. If you can't move on, you're in what we call a prison, in a sense of your own making, in this prison of bitterness and rage and anger. And that's not a good way to live. I mean, there's no way, if you're in the prison of resentment, that you can live a life of joy and fulfillment. It's just not possible. So we want to help people. We're dealers in hope. We want to give people hope here. And there's not a whole lot of hope when you're in the prison of blame and bitterness and anger.
So why have you placed greater emphasis, Warwick, on forgiveness as critical to moving beyond a crucible since starting the podcast? You've always talked about it, but since starting the podcast, it's sort of grown in its importance to you in talking about moving beyond your crucible.
When I reflect on the guests we've had on Beyond the Crucible, I'd be hard pressed to think of anybody that hasn't found a way to forgive and move on. And that is amazing in one sense. In another sense, it kind of makes sense that they've found a way to forgive, because if you just sort of wallow in bitterness and anger, and it can be in different ways. You may be angry at yourself. I can't believe I did what I did. And in my case, the vast majority of my anger, if you will, at what happened with the family media business and the takeover, was directed at myself. It was more, how could I have been so dumb? I had a Harvard MBA. How could I have, thought it was a great idea to launch this takeover? And in particular, think that other family members wouldn't sell out and wouldn't want to be in a company controlled by a 26-year-old. That's not rocket science. You don't have to have a Harvard MBA to figure out they probably won't take that deal. They'll say thanks, but no thanks. Who would? And so that was me, but you could be angry at people that have wronged you. And when we say forgive, it doesn't mean condoning what happened. But if you don't forgive, as we often say, they're like chains. You're in this prison. We also talk about how it's like drinking poison. Very often, if somebody's wronged you, they could care less. They're not really thinking about it at all, which is absolutely galling and frustrating. But for you, there can be this sense of, if I forgive, then I make what that other person did to me okay. And that's just a false choice, a false way of looking at it. Forgiving doesn't make it okay. Forgiving means that, if you want to be blunt about it, they don't win. They win if you're trapped in anger and bitterness, if you want to look at it that way. So the only way you can move forward and have a life-affirming vision, which we talk about as a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others, the only way you can even begin to think about using your pain to help others is through forgiveness. Because if you can't forgive yourself or others, you'll have no energy to do anything positive. All your energy will be wrapped up in anger, and bitterness, and grieving. And it's okay to feel that for a season, but not for a lifetime. There's no way you'll be able to have a positive life. And what we also say a lot on Beyond the Crucible is anger and bitterness leaks. So what happens is, when you're angry and bitter about what happened to you, or even the mistakes you made, that anger will leak out into your husband, wife, partner, family members, co-workers. Those you love and care for the most will get the brunt of your anger and bitterness, and they don't deserve it. It's not the fault of those you love when other people are the ones that are responsible, and not them, and or you're responsible. So lack of forgiveness, it just makes no sense to just stay there.
There's another, our fourth learning comes from another guest who provided a really, really strong example of how to deal with crucible experiences that are maybe, in this particular case, not the traditional quote unquote crucible experience. We came to call them quiet crucibles. And this is our fourth learning, is it's never too late to pursue a fresh life of significance. And that guest who we learned this from was Robert Miller, who was a guest on our series that we did called Second Act Significance. That was episode 112. Here's how we described his show in our show notes. Robert Miller wanted to make music his career from the time he picked up an instrument in high school, but he did not get to fulfill that desire until after he retired. His dreams were deferred by the usual beats of life. A successful career that took him in another direction, family joys and responsibilities, and a crucible in his 40s when he broke his neck in an accident. But in his 60s, he grabbed his guitar and launched his band Project Grand Slam, and finally felt the rush of playing original songs at festivals and concerts around the world. His success in pursuing his lifelong passion also led him to create his top-rated podcast, Follow Your Dream. Let's take a look and listen to a clip from that show.
You have a dream, you have a path, you have a burning desire. Life gets in the way. We don't plan for it. It just happens. And it happens to most of us. Most people don't wind up doing exactly what they dreamt they would be doing when they were younger. Either it wasn't practical, or it wasn't in the cards, or their uncle offered them a job and, they went into this, that, or the other thing. Stuff happens. That's the usual case. It's the unusual case of somebody that knows at an early age, this is what I want to do, and they actually do it. So the question then becomes, all right, do you let that dream go, Was it just a youthful fancy of some sort? Or do you pursue it? And frankly, when I decided to jump into the deep end of the pool, I had just passed my 60th birthday. And I said to myself, if I don't do it now, when the heck am I going to do it?
So Warwick, this idea of second act significance was so powerful that we did indeed build an entire series around it. Why is Robert's experience so helpful to those who are going through what we came to call a, is this all there is moment in their lives?
You know, Gary, Robert Miller spent most of his life being sensible and practical. Robert grew up in a musical family in New York City. His dad really loved jazz and was a jazz musician. And Robert had this dream of being a rock star. But as is often the case, a lot of people think of things when they're kids, and those dreams die as we're urged to be sensible and practical. He's somebody that could write. And so he ended up being an attorney, actually a New York bankruptcy attorney.
Right.
And one of the challenges he found was that he was very successful. He was really good at his job. And so that just kept him on that track. As he puts it in that clip, life gets in the way. And being a bankruptcy attorney, it gave him and his family a nice lifestyle. It's hard to get off that track because, look, I'm good at this. I don't know that I love it, but it's giving me a nice lifestyle, which is great. But those nagging thoughts of what might have been never went away. So at age 60, Robert Miller decides to do really what's almost unthinkable. He takes the leap and begins the steps to being a rock musician. Now, he was sensible in how he approached it. He didn't, have this vision of playing Madison Square Garden. But he went one step at a time, found a band on Craigslist, found a place where he could begin to play with some other folks and, play in coffee shops and, bars, different places, step by step. So I think what Robert's experience shows, and his decision, his choice to make that leap to a different career, a different vocation, is that it's never too late. Sometimes, you could be a teenager, you could be in college, graduate school, 30s, 40s, at any age. It's amazing how many people think, oh, it's too late.
Right.
I can't, maybe I can't jump now. Like maybe you took all arts courses in high school. And it's like, look, I think maybe I want to be a doctor or I want to go into some, science related field. Well, I kind of didn't take the requisite courses. I'd have to go back to community college or have to do some other way. And you think, oh, it's too late. I should have taken those science courses in high school, but I didn't. It's astounding at different points in your life how you can often think, oh, it's too late. I have no option. I can't change now. It's too difficult. Well, I think what Robert Miller shows is if you can change direction at 60 years old and decide to become a rock musician, then I think any of us can make a shift irrespective of our time in life.
Yeah. And I think another learning from Robert's story is that it's not too late to pursue your second act significance, but it's also that the life of, he became a rock musician. He had, rated albums, top rated albums. He's done that. He's played concerts. He's done that, but he's also, in addition to that success, quote unquote, he has gotten a life of significance out of the podcast and encouraging others to do that. And in many ways, Warwick, what he's doing, right? His Crucible is quiet. I never got to follow my dream. He follows it. He succeeds. And then he helps others do the same thing through the Follow Your Dream podcast. That's not really that much unlike your example of coming back from your Crucible, founding this podcast, founding Beyond the Crucible as a brand, and then founding this podcast and talking to people about these things. So there is something to be said about when you follow your dream and you achieve it, then giving it away, then helping others, leading that life of significance. He's done that. You've done that. And that's a critical point of what we try to encourage people to do on the podcast, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. He is giving back through his podcast, Follow Your Dream. I'm sure he's making a lot of people happy with his music with Project Grand Slam, where it's sort of a Latin jazz fusion. And the other point we can learn from Robert is that dreams and visions evolve. When he decided to shift from his legal career to being a musician and hopefully a rock star, he didn't think about the Follow Your Dream podcast. That grew later. So I think what that says is it's never too late to change directions in your life and career. And that vision that you have, that can evolve and shift. It's a journey. Follow that journey, follow your heart, follow that inner voice that's calling you to try different things. It's not one and done. Hey, I'm a rock star. That's great. Mission accomplished. If there are new visions and new dreams, follow that star, if you will, follow that inner voice. And that's exactly what Robert Miller did.
And that's exactly what we're celebrating right here. You did that, right? You wanted to get your book out that talked about your crucible and your bounce back from that crucible. But hey, it changed a bit, and here's a podcast. So you followed the same path.
Well said.
Let's go to the fifth point that we've learned, the fifth learning that this podcast has taught us. And that one is this: knowledge is power. That phrase, Warwick, we mentioned that more often in our series exploring the findings from our Trials to Triumphs self-assessment. That was the phrase we probably used the most, other than Warwick and Cheryl and Gary. I mean, other than our names, I think we said that more than anything else, especially as we dug into the details of the profiles, other than the profile of hitting your stride, which was, you're smooth sailing. The reality is that to get from trials to triumphs, you have to understand the trials, process the emotions of them, and then apply the wisdom they taught you to keep navigating your way to a life of significance. So before I ask you specifically about knowledge being power and why that phrase resonated with us, I thought it would be good to run through the assessment itself and what it taught us, the ways it helps us understand the experience of suffering a crucible and moving beyond it. So I'll let you kind of walk through just a 30,000 foot level what we found from the assessment.
The assessment taught us that there are different stages along our journey. There's stage one, which is the aftermath of your life-altering crucible moment. Stage two is processing the fallout from a crucible. What happened? Why did it happen? What's going on here? Stage three, casting a new post-crucible vision for your life, which we believe a vision that's really going to last is a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. And then stage five is triumph. That's living in light of this new vision, this new life of significance vision that will lead you to have an exciting post-crucible life. For all of us, we have different journeys. As outlined in the assessment, there are different paths along that journey. And so we're all unique individuals. And so each of us have a unique path. And we all have a unique you are here point. So that could differ depending on our age, gender, personality, belief system, marital status. There are different journeys and different you are here points. But irrespective of the journey and where you are, there are stages you need to go through to get beyond your crucible. And this assessment really outlines those stages.
So here is Cheryl Farr, founder of Signal Brand Innovation and a key member of the team at Beyond the Crucible, who came up with, she sort of birthed the idea of doing the assessment. Here's her talking about the importance of knowledge is power for our podcast series on the assessment.
Knowledge is power because it allows you to understand where you are. It gives you that gift of self-reflection, first of all, right? Is to stop and say, how am I different, right? How do we define a crucible? A crucible is a moment, a trauma or loss that is so significant that it has changed the trajectory of our life somehow. It gives us knowledge is power because it gives us the opportunity to say, okay, how has my life been changed? How have I changed, right? what has this done for me? What new path am I on? How have I been refined? Hence the crucible, right? How have I been refined by the fires I've walked through? And I think knowledge is also power in terms of where I am on this map, in terms of what am I going through right now? What have I processed and what haven't I? What have I re-envisioned and what haven't I yet? You know, if you're lost, the first thing you do is you've got to locate yourself. If you're physically lost, say you're walking around New York City and you're physically lost, the first thing you got to do is figure out where you're at before you can figure out where you can go next.
So, Warwick, why is that such a pivotal idea for all of us in how we fulfill our role as dealers in hope for people? Why is the simple phrase, knowledge is power, so meaningful and helpful to those who go through a crucible?
You know, when you go through a crucible, you have a choice. You can stick your head in the sand and say, this was awful, this was painful, this is my worst day ever, it was so unfair, what they did to me, the mistakes that I made. You can wallow in bitterness, anger, self-recrimination, hatred towards yourself, hatred towards others. But the problem is that's not going to be helpful. You'll be in a pit of despair your whole life. Who wants to live in the pit of despair? And so Cheryl's comment that knowledge is power is so profound. It's one of the most profound comments that we've had in the 5 years of this podcast, because knowledge of not just what happened in your crucible, but why it happened and what are the lessons you can learn are so helpful. It helps you move beyond your crucible. It helps you understand kind of what happened. I mean, I kind of, I'm self-reflective by nature. So I spent quite a lot of years, not just talking about, not just thinking to myself, you know, how awful it was, but thinking about, you know, why did it happen? As I was able to think more rationally rather than just being angry at myself, I began to realize, well, I was born into this notion that I was going to be the heir apparent. I heard, you know, I believed my parents' truth that other family members weren't doing a good job. And I obviously was affected by my dad being thrown out by the family members in 1976. I was able to delve into that crucible and understand there are reasons why somebody with a Harvard MBA makes poor decisions. And it makes sense that I made poor decisions given the toxic mix of emotion, feeling my father was, you know, wronged a number of years before in 1976, believing I was the heir apparent, wanting to restore the company to the image of the founder. So as I learned all this, I became less harsh on myself. I came to realize, okay, yeah, I made mistakes. It wasn't all my fault. There was a mix of things. Certainly a lot of it was, but it was a combination. So knowledge is power is so helpful if you understand what happened and why it happened. Then it actually can make it easier for you to forgive yourself and others. I've found even in understanding people that have wronged me over the years, or, you know, wronged my father, for instance, as they understand what made them who they are, doesn't mean that I condone it, but to understand it makes it easier to process, to forgive, and move forward. It's been a huge lesson in my life. Not just knowledge is power, understanding your own situation, but understanding the motives and the backgrounds of others that may have wronged you or may have wronged people you love. So it's really critical to be able to move on and forgive and to chart your own life and significance post-crucible. It's critical to understand what happened and why. So in that sense, knowledge is power. Knowledge is really the key to freedom from the pit of despair. It gives you the ability to move forward, to begin to think about a life-enhancing vision, a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others.
So folks, is that assessment sound interesting? If it sounds interesting, it's free for you to take. Seriously. You can go to beyondthecrucible.com. Very easily, you can find the button to take this free assessment, and you can discover the very things that we're talking about here. You can discover both where you are on your map coming back from your crucible, but just as importantly, you can learn the truth of knowledge being power, because that's what this assessment, your assessment results will give you, is knowledge. Warwick, that wraps up the 5 points that we're talking about. We've covered a lot of ground, not just on this episode, but over the last 5 years, we've covered a lot of ground. We've actually created some things for we can talk about over the next 5 years after this to the next 10 years. So I just have one more question for you, and that is this. How have you been surprised by the ways in which the podcast has added to the knowledge base of Beyond the Crucible, and not just the podcast, but the brand of Beyond the Crucible?
I feel like I've learned so much from this podcast, from our discussions, from our interviews with guests, from the movies we've done.
Right.
I mean, even a musical that we did in the summer, Singing in the Rain. It was part of our American Film Institute top 100 movies. Most of us have seen Singing in the Rain. It's a musical. What can you learn from a musical? They're typically not made with Shakespeare-like plots.
Right.
But yet, there were things that we learned, some profound lessons. Go have a listen or a watch, and you can pick up some of those lessons. But I feel like I've learned so much. Some of it has been deepening my knowledge of how you get beyond a crucible, understanding the stories that we talk about better, the themes of the book discusses, authenticity, vision, team members, shared vision, perseverance. But there have been a number of things that I didn't really think about before our discussions and our learnings from others in this podcast over the last 5 years. We've talked about 5 of the top learnings that we've had. I mean, things like your worst day is your worst day, and a crucible can be a gift. I mean, I've meditated on that over the last 5 years a lot, and it has been such a gift to me personally. My hope is it's a gift to our listeners and viewers. So I feel like I've grown in my knowledge of what it takes to get beyond a crucible. Yes, in some ways from our discussions and meditations and dialogues on this, but so much of it has been from our guests. I feel like in every discussion we have, or in every interview we have with a guest, or in every movie that we cover, I always learn something, and often things that are just profound. So I enjoy that so much, learning, and I think it's my hope, and I believe it's our hope, that these learnings aren't just useful to us, but they're useful to people who are listening and watching, so that they find more help, more practical tools, more, wisdom, we would hope, to get beyond their worst day and to find a way to have a life-affirming vision that helps others, a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others.
Well, that, folks, brings the plane in for a landing on our discussion of the top learnings from 5 years. 5 years today, in case you're joining late. 5 years today, or in case you forgot it from the beginning. 5 years today of the Beyond the Crucible podcast. That'll end our conversation about the learnings. But it did occur to us that there's one more thing that we'd like to leave you with, listeners, and it's not our favorite episodes, right? That's a bit of a cliche for anniversary celebrations. It's not our favorite episodes, but one show from each of us that we think captures the essence of what we've been endeavoring to do with this podcast for these past 5 years. Think of it as the one show each of us encourages you to watch or listen to that will best inform you of what this podcast is all about. If you want to introduce your friends or family to the show, and we hope you do, this is a good episode to start with. And you'll find links to these episodes in the show notes for this episode. So I'm going to go first, and I'm going to go with episode number 82, Warwick, and that's our guest was Heather Kampf. And here's the show notes, since we've been reading show notes from all the episodes that we refer to. Here's the show notes from the show about Heather Kampf. It was a moment seen by tens of millions of people across the globe, thanks to a viral video. Heather Kampf falling during the final lap of an 800-meter race in college, then springing to her feet to not just catch her competition, but beat them. Yet Kampf cautions those amazed by her triumph to take a deeper message away from her 2008 feat than never give up. What fueled her miraculous comeback was having a vision for the race long before it started and sticking to that vision when the Crucibles came. What she discovered about herself during that final lap and in the setbacks and struggles before and since is that her faith gives her access to another gear critical to harnessing resilience on and off the track. The thing about this episode, Warwick, that made me pick it out of 235 episodes that we have is setback and failure are often used as synonyms, interchangeable words, right? They mean the same thing. But what struck me about Heather's story is that while she had a setback, she did not have a failure. Yes, the setback, she fell during that last lap, but she got back up and she not only finished the race, but she won the race. She had a setback, but not a failure. And I think this is enormously instructive to what we do here at Beyond the Crucible. It spotlights the truth that trials are not a period in your life's sentence. They're a semicolon. You can move forward from them wiser and more equipped to handle future challenges and write whatever end of the sentence you want to write. Anything you want to write after that semicolon, you're able to do as you move beyond your crucible. I think that's a powerful truth that this show has taught us is alive and well in so many people of such diverse backgrounds and varied experiences. So that's why Heather Kampf's episode is my pick for this is what Beyond the Crucible is all about.
So Gary, that is such a great episode that you picked. Such a great story. Here's Heather Kampf, who was a University of Minnesota athlete. And that video that went viral of her competing in 2008 when she was in college in that 800-meter, I think it was an indoor track, when she falls and gets up. I mean, that just is such a model that setbacks and failure can build resilience, never give up. I mean, she was an athlete who trained in many different conditions. She was ready for that moment. She was ready mentally, physically, that when she fell, it's like, okay, I fell. I've still got a shot. I mean, she had this notion that if she finishes, if she managed to, beat that last person at the end of the pack, that she would at least get 1 point for the team.
Right.
So she was focused on that would have been a win if she can just get 1 point for the University of Minnesota track team. Now, I don't know that she was thinking of winning it, but she was thinking, let me get up and see what I can do. If I can get a point for the team, it'll be something. So it was a realistic goal. So we can learn so much from Heather Kampf about not giving up. She was things happen when you're in a track meet and there's a bunch of people together, and the runner behind her kind of clipped her ankle and fell, and it wasn't intentional, but things happen in running. But she didn't let that. She didn't do anything wrong. She didn't let that crucible define her. She got up, finished the race, and I'm sure got more than a point. I don't know how many points you get for winning, but I'm sure it's a lot. So it was just an incredible role model. A setback doesn't have to be defining. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. It's like, okay, it happened. Let's get back up there and finish the race. It's an incredible role model for us.
Yeah, and as you listen to the episode, folks, that we're going to have in the show notes. In fact, we'll have both the audio version and the video version. And the video version of that show will show Heather sort of narrating the clip that we're talking about where she falls and then she runs, that viral video clip that's been seen by millions of people. So we'll include that in the show notes as well. But that is indeed just a great episode for establishing what we're about. So I'm dying to know, Warwick, what's your episode that you would pick out of all the episodes that we've done in 5 years that speaks to the essence of Beyond the Crucible?
Well, that episode is actually a 2-part episode. It shows you how much we enjoyed it. And the person I picked was Lisa Blair.
And the great thing, Warwick's right, 2-part episode. But here's the funny part about it, folks. The behind the scenes that doesn't come out in the episodes is that it wasn't planned as a 2-part episode.
No.
We were having the episode, right? We were talking to Lisa Blair, and she was so interesting. And Warwick was asking her so many great questions that about, what would have been about halfway through, we started communicating, Warwick and I, as she's still talking on chat on our recording devices about, let's just split this into 2 episodes when we're done. So we found a point that we could stop that was happening. And then we just cut them into 2 episodes afterwards. So it wasn't planned, but it was worth it. And here's what those episodes talk about. I'm going to read you the show notes for both episodes, 47 and 48 of the Beyond the Crucible podcast. She's known internationally as the first woman to sail solo around Antarctica, a celebrated explorer who fought through unimaginable trials en route to setting her world record. But before she ever stepped foot off dry land, Lisa Blair was a shy, reserved Australian girl bullied at school. She headed off to university determined to shed the mask she wore in high school, and later learned the importance of viewing failure not as falling short, but not trying at all. How amazing. I'll just say this, that Warwick and I pick out of all the episodes we have in 5 years, episodes that have the same sorts of themes. She found her life's calling when a sailing journey with a friend led her to fall in love with the sea and the beauty and adventure it offers. That's episode 47. Here's episode 48 show notes. She set out on a quest to become the first woman to sail solo around Antarctica, but 72 days in, when a horrific storm with waves as high as a 2-story building caused her mast to topple and nearly sank her boat, Lisa Blair's journey changed from setting a record to staying alive. In the hours that followed, she called on her months of preparation, all the courage she could muster, and her indefatigable spirit to steady her craft, then broke off pursuit of the record to head to port in Cape Town, South Africa, for repairs. But she refused to let the myriad and monumental crucibles she'd endured derail her dream. There's another example of following your dream. She refused to let it derail her dream. She launched a second run at the record books and secured her place in nautical history. Talk a bit about why that is so emblematic of what Beyond the Crucible is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Lisa Blair is an amazing person. And what's interesting is here's somebody that sailed around Antarctica. You got to sail below a certain latitude, sort of a racetrack, as they call it. And the seas around Antarctica are the worst in the world. As you mentioned in the show notes, I mean, sort of waves as high as a 2-story building. It's very tough. It's very cold, very forbidding. But Lisa Blair did that. She's also sailed in the Trans-Tasman race, which is between Australia and New Zealand. She's sailed in the Whitbread around the world race that, is obviously around the world. And so how does all that happen? And what's interesting is when she talks about herself, she says that she's really nothing special. She would say that, she's average height, not particularly athletic, not that really different than other people. So she really doesn't have any particular skills or abilities from her perspective. But yet, from my perspective, Lisa's superpower is her mindset, her ability to learn and not be defined by setbacks or failure. she views setbacks as just setbacks. As she says, failure is not trying. So long as you've tried, it's not failing. So when that first time she tried to break the record to be, the fastest woman to sail around Antarctica, and when her mast broke in very heavy seas, she had to go off the racetrack, if you will, north to Cape Town, South Africa. She could say, well, I failed in my attempt to be, the fastest woman to sail around Antarctica. But she didn't view that as failure. It was a setback. Now, later, she would accomplish her goal of sailing around Antarctica. But that setback was just a setback because she tried, and therefore, and from her definition, she didn't fail. And so, her superpower in her mindset, she doesn't really have any fear of failing. Because from her perspective, people say failing is not an option. Well, because she views failure as not trying, since she always tries, then in that sense, in some weird sense, she never fails because she always tries. She has setbacks, but she doesn't have fear of failing. And what's amazing is she is driven, but she is eager to learn, and she has no sense of pride about asking others for help. So she found contacts who got her into the Trans-Tasman race, as I mentioned. She found people that were willing to have her on their boat on the Whitbread race. Even the boat that she had to sail around Antarctica, she doesn't have much money. She found people to sponsor her so she could afford to have a boat. I mean, it's just truly remarkable. It's an Olympic level mindset that just, it boggles my imagination. It's hard for me to understand somebody that has no fear of failure, that is willing to try anything, that's willing to learn from others. It's not like she never has a thought about, oh, what will they think if I ask them for help? She just doesn't care. If they can help her, she'll ask. So, we could learn an enormous amount from Lisa Blair, her Olympic level mindset. I mean, if we had a half of her mindset, it's hard to fathom what we couldn't achieve. And we could achieve almost, anything, within reason, or maybe even beyond reason. With her mindset, it's hard for me to relate to her, to be honest, because I like to think I have an okay mindset, an Olympic level mindset, a Lisa Blair level. It's, the bar is high, but I think we could learn a lot from her as we approach our own lives. And we try to navigate our own path beyond our crucible to lead our own lives of significance.
I just realized that as you were talking here, here's how I'm going to end the show. We'll use our two emblematic episodes for metaphors. So let's cross the finish line on this show, and let's go to port. Let's go into port. We finished the sailing route, and we finished the race. So that's a wrap on this 5th anniversary episode of the show. Remember, in the show notes, you can find the links to the episodes that Warwick and I have discussed here at the end. But also, we ask you to do this. If you've enjoyed this conversation, if you've enjoyed revisiting some of these pivotal moments from previous episodes, we encourage you to, on your favorite podcast app where you're listening to the show, where you can listen to the show, you can find Beyond the Crucible, subscribe to Beyond the Crucible, because every week, I'm telling you, you've heard it here. We came up with 3 things that we can talk about the next time we do an anniversary show of key learnings just from our dialogue here. That's the kind of dealers in hope, Warwick's term, that we endeavor to be here at Beyond the Crucible. So I encourage you, Warwick encourages you, subscribe to the show. Keep listening and watching it, and you will find these kind of learnings just keep popping up. And remember, until the next time we're together, that your Crucible experience isn't the end of your story. It isn't, in fact, a failure if you learn from that and you keep moving forward. And where it can lead to, and we've talked about it throughout this episode, the end goal, the end result, where you want to go, is to a life of significance. Welcome to a journey of transformation with the Beyond the Crucible assessment. Unlike any other, this tool is designed to guide you from adversity to achievement. As you answer a few insightful questions, you won't just find a label like the helper or the individualist. Instead, you'll uncover your unique position in the journey of resilience. This assessment reveals where you stand today, the direction you should aim for, and crucially, the steps to get there. It's more than an assessment. It's a roadmap to a life of significance. Ready? Visit beyondthecrucible.com. Take the free assessment and start charting your course to a life of significance today.